Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss an incident which may or may not have occurred between Hezbollah and Israel. Now, UN peacekeepers, i.e. UNIFIL specifically, is investigating an incident on Lebanon's southern border after Israel alleged that it had foiled a quote-unquote infiltration attempt by Hezbollah, though the group itself has said that these allegations are completely and absolutely not true. Now, there were fears that a confrontation would arise, that fear on the part of Israel, of course, in retaliation to its killing of a Hezbollah fighter in Syria not too long ago. Now, we know, of course, Israel has been attacking what it calls, of course, our Hezbollah or pro-Iran positions in Syria for quite a while now, and it's done this a number of times. Nevertheless, Israel was expecting some sort of retaliation this time around. Did it happen this way or not? As I said, Hezbollah has already denied this. Even, in fact, Israeli media and some within Israel proper itself have said that this may not have occurred at all, and that this may be, in some ways or not, they've just cast doubt on this entire issue and whether or not it really happened in the way that is being presented to the public at this time. Let's now discuss all of this a bit further. I'm joined by Laith Marouf, who is an award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant. His work spans issues connected to indigenous nations as well as the Arab peoples. He's joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Joining us from Jerusalem is Azriel Bermant, who is a lecturer in international relations at Tel Aviv University. He is the author of Margaret Thatcher and the Middle East. Azriel and Laith, thank you both for your time today. Azriel, let me start with you. And I wanted to start off right with the end of my introduction there about how even within Israeli media, there have been those who have doubted this official version of events, even the likes of Jerusalem Post, for example. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, well, the Jerusalem Post raised the possibility that this infiltration by Hezbollah did not actually occur, that perhaps there's a precedent for this because, of course, in September 2019, Israel, when Hezbollah shot an anti-tank missile at Israel, Israel appeared to suggest that its number of its soldiers were hurt. In the incident, it later transpired that, in fact, no one was hurt. Perhaps this was a way of Israel to enable Hezbollah to claim some kind of victory and enable Hezbollah to step back. However, this time around, it seems to me that there was an incident. And in fact, IDF have said that they will be releasing footage of the infiltration attempt in the next few days.
Okay, so then, in fact, when it comes to that video or proof of some sort, that's something that a lot of people have asked for, right? That let's see exactly what happened. Do you think something did happen? Would this have been the retaliation, essentially, that Israel was expecting and that Hezbollah had promised?
I actually believe nothing has happened, and the proof of that is we have a historical record of Hezbollah saying exactly the truth, and we have a historical record of exaggerated and falsified information from the apartheid regime in Israel. So we also know that on the day of, there was at least 4 different stories that were relayed by Israeli officials and military apparatus in the Israeli media, and it was repeated, these 4 different stories over multiple hours, almost 4 hours before Hezbollah came out with a statement that said clearly they were not on the border, they were not involved in any incident, that actually the Israeli apartheid army was shooting at ghosts at its own, probably even. And we also heard one of the reports from Israeli media, which I don't know if we should believe or not, that a 19-year-old new recruit spotted something, and that started this whole, confrontation with the jinn, with the ghosts of Hezbollah. And so, no, I don't believe anything that comes out of the occupation forces in apartheid Israel.
Okay, so Israel, I want to just, obsessively just talk about this specific incident. But I wonder, do you not think that at some point Israel should be expecting retaliation for all the attacks it has carried out in Syria. Be it, as it says, of course, Hezbollah targets, pro-Iran targets, etc. I mean, all of that, I would imagine the Israelis know will not go, quote unquote, unanswered, if that's the right term.
Israel believes there's a high probability that Hezbollah will try and strike back because one of its personnel was killed in an Israeli attack, and Hezbollah has effectively boxed itself in by promising that it would retaliate. The question is, to what degree will Hezbollah retaliate? And there would be definitely strong constraints on Hezbollah. It would be constrained, obviously, because of the circumstances it finds itself in right now, with Lebanon engulfed. First of all, the pandemic, the coronavirus, and secondly, the severe economic distress within Lebanon. The last thing Hezbollah wants is to find itself in an all-out war with Israel. But the same applies to Israel. Israel also wants to avoid a war with Hezbollah. So the chances are that if Hezbollah were to do something, it would be something on a relatively small scale.
But I wonder, Israel, I do apologize for interrupting. This just came to my mind. But I mean, you're saying that Israel does not want a confrontation, right? But then nevertheless, it still carried out that strike in Syria, killing that Hezbollah fighter. So it almost seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, by default, that Israel's sort of, hitting the hornet's nest and is not expecting to have anything come back to it?
This is the dilemma Israel faces, because on the one hand, it wants to ensure that Hezbollah, for example, in Syria, Israel is very concerned about Hezbollah's precision missiles and concerned about the arms reaching Hezbollah, and also, of course, about Iranian strengthening its position within Syria. So Israel is constantly having to ask itself that on the one hand, it needs to feels the need to ensure that Hezbollah isn't in a position to make life intolerable for Israel, and of course these precision missiles, which Israel's worried about. So on the one hand, it feels the need from time to time to carry out targeted strikes against Hezbollah. On the other hand, if it's not careful, there is a danger they could find itself in a confrontation with Hezbollah. So Israel has to constantly bear in mind that risk.
Okay, Laith, what are your thoughts about that? Because, I mean, obviously we know that Hezbollah has said that it would retaliate, right, for these attacks on it, even, quote-unquote violations, of course, of Lebanese airspace, which happens fairly often, even according to the Lebanese government and its own officials, of course. All of the above cannot go unanswered, right, at some level?
Yes, I mean, Israel is in itself always wanting to breach international law. It thinks that it's above international law, it's above humanitarian law. It thinks that it can breach any country's airspace, and it can bomb at will anywhere it wants. And supposedly no one is supposed to be able to retaliate for these breaches, and nobody is holding them accountable because the protection from the imperial forces that created this apartheid state in the middle of the Arabic world. But Hezbollah has made it clear. Sayyid Nasrallah, the leader, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, said that any attack on any cadre of Hezbollah anywhere in the world will be retaliated upon directly by Hezbollah. So this has been the formula that of engagement that has been set by Hezbollah last year. Right after the killing of the cadre of Hezbollah in Damascus, the Israeli officials sent a statement through the United Nations basically begging Hezbollah not to retaliate and claiming that they didn't know that there was a Hezbollah member in this location. But,
right.
It shows you on the one hand that Israel is not serious about, respecting international law. and that the only way to ensure that Hezbollah in Israel does not continue to violate international law is by forcing them to respect international law, and that comes with these expected retaliation that is going to happen.
Okay, Azriel, I'm getting a final word. I wanted to also talk just very briefly, if you can, about UNIFIL, which is the United Nations interim force in Lebanon. There is talk and chatter, and you may have probably heard this, I'm sure, that possibly this entire issue and this what may or may not have happened in this incident that we're talking about right now is the aim is to essentially change the structure of UNIFIL and how it may operate, because we know its mandate is up for renewal next month. Do you think that there is some legitimacy to that possibility?
I don't think so. I think that Israel had to Israel's actions against Hezbollah. There is always the risk that possibility that Hezbollah personnel will be obviously be killed in such operations, and then there's been tension on the northern border for some time now, an uneasy, very difficult, uneasy tension, and there is I think that the situation with UNIFIL is obviously there in the background, but the fact is, I think the difficulty, what is happening with Hezbollah is also have to take into account the fact that Hezbollah itself, there are some who argue certainly within Israel, that there is a risk that because of the very difficult situation within Lebanon and the pressure Hezbollah is under because of the serious economic situation there, they might actually seek to use that as a means to deflect from the hardship it is in, from the situation it is under, from the pressure it is under. And that may also be why there is a danger that Hezbollah could also carry out retaliation against Israel. There may be an added incentive for it to do so.
Right. We'll have to leave there as a final word. Of course, continue this conversation at a later time with both of you as well, of course. But we appreciate both Azriel and Laith for their time today and the context that brought to this discussion. This incident, as we're saying, on the Lebanon southern border, Hezbollah disputes that it even happened, really, even though, of course, it has promised retaliation for the attack that Israel carried out in Syria, killing one of its fighters there. There's a lot to discuss, right? UNIFIL, as Azriel mentioned at the end, he doesn't believe that this has to do with that. Nevertheless, there is talk about the fact that Israel may be wanting to change the mandate of UNIFIL, and that has been something that has been brought up a number of times over the past couple of years whenever there has been talk of UNIFIL. So is this possibly an attempt to do that? I mean, of course, there's no guarantees about that, but this may very well be an attempt to do that if this is not proven to be true. Israel, though, has said that there may be some sort of video proof released of this incident that Israel has alleged that Hezbollah tried to infiltrate into its territory. Nevertheless, there is the context, and that's a very factual and real point to make. There's a context in both places, right? Within Israel, too, we have political upheaval in the sense of we have those charges against Netanyahu, those court cases, as well as the pandemic. He's not exactly a popular leader right at this point in time with certain parts of the population. There's the whole issue of annexation and the pressure on Israel for that. And then on the other side, yes, we do have Lebanon, which is in very dire economic straits right now. So would Hezbollah also realistically want a war to start right now? It seems both don't, but as I'd put to Israel, why then keep hitting the hornet's nest? Why try to awaken something that you don't really want to start by continually attacking Hezbollah as well as pro-Iran fighters, as Israel alleges in Syria and elsewhere? I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a quote-unquote price tag attack that has taken place in the West Bank, purportedly by Israeli settlers. Now, this is not the first time that a mosque has been attacked throughout the occupied territories. Nevertheless, this latest attack on this mosque, there was an attempt to burn it down, or at least parts of it were set on fire, and then there was racist graffiti and slogans spray painted onto different walls in the mosques, such as the land of Israel for the people of Israel, siege on Arabs and not on Jews, the land of Israel for my people. Those were some of the quotations that were painted on or, vandalized onto the mosque. Palestinian Prime Minister has called this a racist attack, an act, and has held Israel's government responsible for this and for the increasing violence of Israeli settlers in such a situation where we have, of course, pressure about annexation as well of the West Bank. What does all of this then mean in that sort of context at this time? Let's put that to our guest, who is joining us now from Jerusalem. We're joined now by Alan D. Abbey, who is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. He is writing a book on the history of media in Israel-Palestine. Alan, thank you very much for your time today and for joining us. What do you make of this price tag attack?
Well, this is not the first, as you mentioned, and this was, in fact, a racist attack by a small fringe element within Israeli society that is widely condemned by mainstream Israeli society. In fact, even before this event made the news, a group that calls itself Tag Meir, which means light tag or tag to bring light, was out in that community visiting, speaking to the individuals involved, apologizing, and even bringing Quran books for them to make up for anything that was lost in the attack. So that is a much more, in my opinion, not just my opinion, but I think, in fact, a more representative segment of Israeli society, the people who are appalled by such activities and who realize that the individuals involved are a fringe element.
Okay, no, and I appreciate you that context for us, because it makes it a lot easier for us to understand what is happening on the ground there directly. But nevertheless, do you think that there is enough concentration trying to bring people who do carry out such attacks to justice properly?
Well, there have, in fact, been many complaints that the Israeli government doesn't adequately pursue the people who do these attacks, and I think there is some truth to that. However, public pressure is building on the government to crack down on these attacks, and there have been recent incidents with Israeli soldiers actually going to illegal settlements, trying to bring them under control or to literally to take them down, and being opposed by other Israeli citizens who live in these locations. So there is, in fact, an effort to crack down on this. It probably isn't strong enough. And I think activists on the opposite side would, in fact, say that the government hasn't done enough to bring this under control.
Okay, so then, have, of course, as you well know, Alan, the context of, international pressure right now, even from Israel's own allies, about annexation and in the entire promise that Netanyahu had made in the previous elections about going ahead with West Bank annexation. In that context, when we see such an attack, as much of a fringe element as it may be, of course, as you correctly contextualized for us, nevertheless, it sort of doesn't leave a good taste in the mouth, right, of what may be to come if annexation were to go ahead?
Well, I think that attacks like this, as I've said, actually, in regard to attacks by Palestinians, and I'm not equating or doing any tit for tat or whataboutisms here. What I've said before, and I think people say, is that these are attacks out of weakness, not out of strength, that the radical fringe within the settler community, which is a poorly educated, ideologically driven, and feeling pressure, in fact, is not acting out of strength, but is acting out of weakness. And I think this kind of activity, in fact, turns the Israeli populace, which isn't really focused on this issue of annexation, away even more so from this. You may recall the last time we spoke, it was about the annexation plan, and I predicted, and I think have been borne out, that the annexation, while it has been mainstreamed as a conversation matter and is in the air, has not in fact occurred. And the likelihood of significant activities happening remains limited. And I think this is why you see these attacks. They are reactions out of weakness, not out of strength.
Yes, no, indeed. I remember that conversation being proven correct, of course, until this point, that annexation has not gone ahead. I wonder, though, what then happens next, right? Because we are sort of at a stalemate situation, right? When it comes to, I'm talking about the macro issue here, of course, about just peace, and put that in quotation marks, as everyone understand it in individual ways on both sides. But nevertheless, peace between both sides certainly will not come. I think we all agree now from the Trump Middle East peace plan. So then what must happen next? Is Netanyahu, is Gantz, are any of them the men who will make that happen?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think anybody who is honest would tell you they have an answer. From what I gather, for one thing, the Palestinian leadership, which is, occasionally hanging on by a thread and suffering its own challenges within its community, because, of course, Palestinians, both in the West Bank and the Gaza, are not a monolithic entity, but a very complicated, nuanced, and sophisticated society with many layers and many different interests. At the least, that leadership, which is, again, barely holding on, is, in fact, waiting clearly for the end of a Trump administration, which may occur, of course, at the end of this year. On the Israeli side, the so-called unity government of Netanyahu and Benny Gantz is itself teetering. It's teetering not over this issue, but it's teetering over other issues that, frankly, the Israeli political scene sees as more pressing, such as a budget and the welfare and economic health of the country, let alone its physical health. And so there is little chance that any of the leaders of the three countries that we mentioned, or the three political leadership communities we've mentioned, have the strength of the willpower and the ability to focus on this matter at this time. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see the continuation of the fragile and impossible to sustain status quo, even though, as you mentioned, there is talk of annexation is in the air and has in fact been mainstreamed.
Alan, I'm sure the statement by the Jordanian Prime Minister, even though it was not an official government or statement of the Jordanian king, but he had spoken of possible support for a one-state solution right now. So the international community, as you well know, has always spoken about two states living side by side in peace. But there is increasingly, right, at least on one side, seemingly on the quote-unquote pro-Palestinian side, as we may call them, an understanding that we are heading towards that. Is that, do you think, the eventual reality that we're all going to accept?
Well, perhaps in a different world. At the end of World War I, there was a great movement of vision for reducing the amount of nationalism in the world and for countries working together better. Similarly, was addressed and visioned at the end of World War II. In a better world where individuals felt safe and economic prosperity existed, I think many national boundaries would in fact dissolve or soften. The success of the European community until at least recently is an example of that. On the other hand, I can point to many other lands where these efforts have fallen by the wayside or have been, in fact, terribly dangerous and violent. Your part of the world, frankly, India, Baluchistan, Kurdistan, throughout what was the age of previous Yugoslavia. I don't think these multi-ethnic states, frankly, are viable at this time in the world. Jordan would like to see a single Israeli-Palestinian state because it would relieve a lot of pressure from the Palestinian majority within Jordan, which is itself a struggling multi-ethnic state. So I frankly don't see that happening anytime soon.
Okay, let's quickly add another conversation before we let you go. We're now joined by Jeff Halper, who is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He's also joining us from Jerusalem. Jeff, thank you for your time today. Jeff, what do you make of this price tag attack on this mosque?
Well, this has to do with, your previous speaker was talking about multi-ethnic societies. The whole idea of Israel and Zionism is to create a single ethnic, religious, national society, which is Jewish, Israeli, Zionist, and to get rid of everybody else. And so, in a sense, the more that settlers, supported by the army, can intimidate and terrorize the West Bank population, and people want to leave, especially young people. Over time, this is a part of the process of Judaization we talked about, of transforming an Arab country into a Jewish country. It's a small little act, but within a much larger scenario of displacing the indigenous population.
Jeff, then I wonder if you think that would mean, and should mean, in fact, that Israel should be working overtime, shouldn't it, to ensuring that a two-state solution comes to the fore? I mean, at this point, it doesn't seem like it is doing that.
Well, the two-state solution never was in the cards. Nobody is ensuring that it's going to survive. Governments only use it as a way of managing the conflict. And so, we're in a situation where the only solution that's possible, which is decolonization and creating one democratic state for everybody in this country, is absolutely unacceptable to the dominant group in society, which is the Israelis. And so we're in a situation of either apartheid, in which one dominant cultural group asserts its control and domination over all the others, or democracy. Those are the only two options that exist. The two-state solution is an illusion.
All right, Alan, I'll have time to just respond to that. We just have about a minute left. Go ahead.
Well, I would beg to differ with my colleague here in Jerusalem that the state of Israel was founded to be a single multi-ethnic religious state. It, in fact, was mostly founded by secular Jews. It was, in fact, written into the Declaration of Independence that it would be a democracy for all of its citizens, that the Jewish population of Israel has never exceeded 80% of the total. And while there have been and continue to be problems, of course, dealing with the Arab, Israeli, Palestinian residents of Israel, Israel is a multi-ethnic society. It is a multi-racial society. There are people from 150 countries who have very different backgrounds, have come together to create the state of Israel, and many of them are quite different from one another. Just look at our internal politics. Regarding the army as an act of enforcement, the settlers, in fact, have spent quite a bit of time and effort to attack army soldiers, young Israeli individuals who had ostensibly been doing national service and protecting our borders, are in fact brought into a nascent civil war and are treated and called as if they were Nazis, which is probably the worst curse you could throw at an Israeli Jew. And so and I think, again, his analysis or expectation that there are only two choices is a false dichotomy. There is still room for a two-state solution. I think most Palestinians, in fact, are not looking for being part of a single state.
Very well. We'll have to leave it there. I know that we just kept this quite short, but we'll try to have the both of you back on to continue the discussion at a later date. We appreciate, nevertheless, the insight you brought to the conversation. That was Alan and Jeff, both of them speaking to us from Jerusalem, speaking specifically more about this price tag attack on the West Bank mosque there. Alan, they're saying that a lot of Israelis came out and, in fact, apologized, quote unquote, to the community, even handed out Qurans or the otherwise. Now, of course, that's something that has not come out in much media. Nevertheless, that would be a good thing, of course, if that has, in fact, occurred. For harmony of some sort. Nevertheless, this does, though, come on the heels of a troubling pattern, right, where we have seen such sorts of attacks in the past. So it's not the first. If it was the first, then maybe we could have just let it go. But nevertheless, this happened quite a number of times in the past as well. And there hasn't been proper justice meted out, one can arguably say, even as Alan there had also said, that there is criticism even from within Israel about that sort of thing, about accountability for these sorts of attacks. And then, there's the entire question of the West Bank annexation hanging over our heads, which, has not yet occurred, to the credit of all of our guests who said that it would not occur. And then there's the macro issue of just peace between Israelis and Palestinians altogether, one state versus two states. I mean, that's a conversation which continues to grow, mind you. And it's time for us to maybe just, address it head on. Can Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in complete peace in a completely democratic society where all are equal at the same time? I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Umbrella Man. Now, there was a man seen in viral videos right as the George Floyd protest began in Minneapolis, who was seen smashing windows of certain stores. I believe it was an auto parts store, especially that he smashed the windows of. He was completely covered in the sense that you couldn't see his face very clearly, but nevertheless, he was called Umbrella Man because he had an umbrella in his hands. Now it seems that it's come out that the gentleman who was responsible for this, that Umbrella Man himself, is possibly a white supremacist. That changes, doesn't it, the dynamics a lot if we are to look into how Donald Trump and a lot of his officials have spoken about protesters, right? They've spoken about them as being rioters, as them being violent, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, yes, they've used the general terms of peaceful protests, but nevertheless, they keep saying that there's violence towards the United States government. That's almost an exact quote of the Attorney General Barr in front of the congressional hearing, especially when it came to the Portland, Oregon situation and the sending in of federal forces there to control, quote unquote, the situation. This entire narrative, the way it's been presented to us, is that those protesters were the ones that were violent. But it seems that, in fact, there may have been people who were trying to, in fact, stoke violence at that time. And again, as I said, that changes the narrative quite significantly from what we've been made to understand. Let's put that to our guests who are joining us now. We're joined from Atlanta, Georgia by Adrienne Jones, who's an assistant professor of political science at Morehouse College. She studies Black American political development. Joining us from Annville, Pennsylvania is Chris J. Dolan, who is a professor of political science at Lebanon Valley College. He's a Fulbright scholar, University of Pristina, Kosovo, from 2019 to 2020. Chris and Adrienne, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Chris, let me start with you. What do you make of this revelation, right, about Umbrella Man? Because there was so much, and he was under discussion for such a long time, I remember, after that. I mean, for a number of days at least, and within the news cycle, that's forever, about how this proved almost that there was violence on the part of these protesters, looting, all of the above. But it's not as simple as what we all thought.
Yes, no, not at all. Excuse me, not at all. I think the identity of Umbrella Man having been revealed to be a white supremacist from a extremist group that operates in prisons, actually, in Kentucky and Minnesota. Now, what he was trying to do was to sow discord and to cause racial unrest by breaking windows and writing on walls and provoking a violent response, possibly from other groups in the area. But his association is with a group called the Aryan Cowboy Brotherhood, and they are clearly responsible for promoting and stoking violence. There have been past instances in Minnesota where they've attacked, I believe, a young Muslim woman who was racially harassed by a group of, I think it was motorcycle club members wearing insignia associated with this particular hate group. So what it does is it reveals through evidence that the protesters themselves were not initially violent, but the actions of this Umbrella Man caused much of the violence and rioting that did take place for what were otherwise very peaceful protests. Yeah. And it's, yeah.
If I can, I'm just going to go to Adrienne. Adrienne, no doubt there has been probably just a little bit of violence on the part of some, fringe elements within even the protest movement. But nevertheless, as I said, the way it's all being presented to as a narrative, even of, Attorney General Barr saying that, what was happening in Portland was an attack, an assault, I think, on the government of the United States. Those sorts of terms do not really talk then about white supremacy, do they?
Well, first of all, I think there's a problem with the use of the word violence, right? Violence demands bodily injury. So even talking about rioting, that's property damage. It's not violence. And number two, it is very important that people are sabotaging peaceful protests in order to stoke dissent. It's very concerning because the government does portray protesters as if they are inherently rioters, and they are not. And this is not unusual for the American culture, but it is problematic for people who are trying to protest against police brutality, which is in fact violent.
Yeah. So then, when we're talking, Adrienne, about what is meant to then happen next, right? So we have this revelation come out. Do you think that this may mean that the government will finally admit, okay, we need to look into those elements who are in fact trying to stoke more racial tensions than actually bring communities together?
The government will use it as a justification to continue to expand their deployment of federal troops to various cities. They're now in Portland and Seattle. And we've seen these incidents where white individuals, some of them extremists, have broken windows and rioted essentially in numerous cities across the country. So we're talking about Raleigh, North Carolina, Oakland, California, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Atlantic City, Santa Monica, Baltimore, Minneapolis, Eugene, Oregon, Chicago, did I say Madison, Wisconsin, Nashville, Atlanta, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles. So, I mean, it almost strikes some of us as if much of this is intentional in order to be able to crack down on protesters. And protesting in the United States is the right of the citizens under the First Amendment to express dissent against government.
All right, Chris, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. On this issue of Fed forces, right? That's obviously been something of great concern to many, and not just people, but even officials, local officials, especially in many respective cities throughout the country. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the use of federal forces and federal agents is incredibly problematic. Much of these forces that are being deployed are from Customs and Border Patrol, and from other federal agencies who are not trained in dispersing peaceful protesters. I mean, these are professionals who are trained in tracking personnel and doing investigations. Their training is not in rioting, and rioting is not what a lot of this is not what is happening. Most of these are, again, peaceful protests. However, the deployment of those federal forces, I just wanted to expand on something that Adrienne had said. It seems very coordinated and very strategic, and you cannot divorce this from the fact that there's a presidential election going on in 2020. This is a coordinated, strategic response to promote Donald Trump in November.
Very well. We'll have to leave the final word, but we do appreciate both of our guests for their time and their expert insight. This issue, as I said in my introduction, completely changes the narrative, doesn't it? Where a lot of the protests have been presented to the rest of us, at least around the world and even within the country, I believe, as just inherently violent at some level. But it's not like that. And in fact, it seems that a lot of white supremacist groups, far-right groups, are in fact trying to stoke more racial violence than in fact bring the community together. And that's not being fully addressed at this time. I mean, we finally have this revelation now about Umbrella Man and his role in stoking the violence when in Minneapolis, right as the George Floyd protest there began. But then, the far right is essentially getting what it wants in some regards, and we aren't addressing that. We're not seeing the bigger picture here, and the government seemingly is not addressing it either. Why isn't it addressing it at this time? And then what of federal forces and whether or not they're actually playing a helpful or not role in respective cities that they are meant to be deployed to? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.